Hello, my name is Dr. Shyam Ranganathan. I'm a philosopher, a translator, a translation theorist, and a teacher. But I suppose before I really knew how to do any of those things, I was a researcher, first as a student and then as a grad student. And in my work that I'm involved in now takes me back almost to the beginning of my education as a philosophy student, but certainly for the last 20 years as a researcher. And so some of the things that I focused on so far have included the studying of neglected traditions of philosophy, specifically Indian moral philosophy. When I started as a graduate student in philosophy, the common view was there was no such thing as ethics or moral philosophy in the Indian tradition. A really weird and mistaken claim, but it was the common view. And a lot of people still hold these kinds of prejudices, and a lot of my work kind of started off with that as a kind of a practical example or challenge to come to terms with in the study of philosophy. And this kind of blossomed into a wider interest in understanding and translating philosophy from cultures, languages, and traditions that one shares nothing with. Right? It seems pretty easy to say what philosophy is or what philosophers are interested in when you're talking about things that are familiar to you in the way of perspectives and ideas. It becomes a little more challenging when you take that away. But interestingly, philosophy is this discipline where people disagree. So we really shouldn't expect that philosophy has to be something that you do within a tradition of basic assumptions. And at any rate, I was interested in this wider theoretical challenge. How do you do it? How do you understand people when you don't share anything with them in the way of values or culture or language? Okay, and so one of the themes then of a lot of my work is a focus on radical dissent, right? How do we get to the point where we really understand people who we don't agree with? And understanding is actually, it's quite different from fighting, right? A lot of times when people don't understand each other, they're just at each other's throats. Understanding is a more of a kind of a detached, abstract process where you understand things that you don't agree with. Like, how do we get to there? Okay, so one of the main questions then that has preoccupied me is, what is philosophy? Uh, and it wasn't that I was ever particularly doubtful about what philosophy was, because as a student I learned philosophy from my professors. I took a lot of philosophy courses as an undergraduate, and then when I went on in graduate school, I took more courses in philosophy. Um, and if you want to learn philosophy, there are people who will teach it to you. And one of the interesting things that I suppose I picked up on early, and I'm not sure everybody does, but when you're learning philosophy, you are learning a discipline, right? So one way to begin by answering this question of what philosophy is to appreciate that it's a discipline. Okay. And then also that disciplines are the kinds of the practices or procedures that allow us to investigate some data before we know what's true, right? So that's why it is that there is such a thing as higher education. There's higher education because what higher education is based on is on research, and research is made possible by disciplinary expertise where researchers are able to track data before they really know what's going on, right? And the inquiry of tracking the data, if they kind of pursue it far enough, allows them to get to a point where they have something to say about that data, right? And then and what they have to say, what researchers have to say on the basis of kind of tracking the data, is interesting because it's based on the objective evidence. When researchers do say something about the data on the basis of the research, right, there's a higher chance of what they say being true, because they've weeded out poor explanations of the data, right? So, and that's the entire process of research. It doesn't start off with, ideally, with prejudices or some picture that the final explanation has to conform to, right? It's a work in progress, and people are trying to figure out what it is that they're tracking. So, at the basis of a discipline, then, and the idea of a disciplinary research is this idea of objectivity. So this is an idea that it's pretty simple, though. We will talk a little bit about how it gets confused and rendered, mysterious. But objects are the kinds of things that we can converge on from different perspectives, right? So an object is the kind of thing that's going to look different depending upon your perspective, but nevertheless, it plays a role in explaining the disagreement that you're having, right? So you can track an object without necessarily agreeing about what it is that you're looking at. So I like the kind of an archetype of an object that really brings to fore why objects are nifty things is a conch, right? Because a conch is a perfectly asymmetrical object. So it's going to look different depending upon your vantage. But there's only one conch, that anchors these differing impressions, right? So the possibility then about talking about a conch is different than any description you might have of how it seems to you from some perspective, and it's completely consistent with the reality of a conch that people looking at it from different perspectives will have something different to say about it. So disagreement is kind of built into talk about objects from the start, especially interesting objects that are asymmetrical like this. So every discipline is going to have its objects, right, that look different depending upon the theoretical vantage that you come at it. And then the point of the discipline is to get to the point where we could say something about the object that people within a discipline have been disagreeing about. So then the question is, what's philosophy about? What are its objects, but also what is the procedure, the disciplinary procedure that really anchors philosophy as a discipline, right? Because if you understand what the disciplinary procedure is that makes philosophy, you'll have a way of figuring out what kinds of things philosophers track and are interested in when they do research. Now, on our way to this more general discussion about philosophy as a discipline and what it is that philosophers track, right? It's worth noting, and I think it's difficult to ignore, that philosophy has traditionally been dangerous to engage in the Western tradition. Now, I call the Western intellectual tradition, this is something that I've been writing about in my published work, I call this tradition that goes back to ancient Greek philosophy, the West, and I use a slanted W. And I use this notation to distinguish the West as an intellectual tradition from the geography of the West, right? So you could be someplace Western geographically or speaking a language that's Western geographically and not necessarily endorse or be part of this intellectual tradition that's characteristically Western. Okay, so, but one of the interesting, you just have to look at the history of the Western tradition, right? It begins with the murder of a philosopher, the execution, but really the murder of a philosopher, Socrates, right? It's remarkable that the tradition basically begins that way. And then, Socrates was found guilty of promoting false gods and corrupting the youth, right? And so the reason why he was put to death was he didn't toe the party line. There was some view about what it is that he was supposed to be saying and doing, and he wasn't participating in that worldview, in that in the way of living, and the powers that be at the time found that threatening and inconvenient, and so he ended up being found guilty, and then he was sentenced to death by drinking hemlock. Okay, so but Socrates, of course, wasn't the last intellectual in the Western tradition to meet death as a punishment for saying things that were thought to be counterculture or unusual or maybe uncomfortable for the powers that be. Of course, there was Jesus, right? He was engaging in a kind of moral philosophical activity and talking about things like forgiveness and not being judgmental and inclusivity. And for a variety of reasons, the powers of the day found all of that in the attention that he was getting, and his role as this kind of public intellectual threatening, and he was put to death via crucifixion, a very public way to kill someone, right? As a punishment for in this case, basically, saying and doing things that were thought to be not proper or threatening to the powers that be. And then there's a long tradition after this. So one of the ironies, of course, is that in the early Western tradition, the Christians were first. Jesus, of course, was he was persecuted in being crucified, but then early followers of Jesus were persecuted in Rome for being Christian, right? It was thought to be a kind of subversive thing. And then the Romans became Christians. They decided that the official position is going to be Christianity. And then all of a sudden you have this very long history of Christians persecuting people who didn't toe the party line, right? Whatever it is that specific group of Christians thought was a party line, right? And so Hypatia, this very illustrious female philosopher, was basically lynched. And then there was Boethius. Boethius was a philosopher who was thrown in prison by the powers of his day. And actually, he wrote a famous book called The Consolations of Philosophy while in prison, but he was executed too. And there's a long history of this kind of thing in the Western tradition, where intellectuals who didn't say the things that were thought to be the kinds of things you were supposed to say were oppressed. And in the Middle Ages, of course, the church ended up deciding in large measure what you were allowed to say and what you weren't allowed to say. But this continues in many parts of the world where if you trace back the philosophical heritage of those folks, goes back to ancient Greek philosophy, and you find lots of places where there's someone in power and you can't say anything that they don't want you to say. You have to basically say what's expected of you. So what's interesting about all of this? Well, first of all, the reason why it's noteworthy for us is that if you're interested in philosophy, it's quite apparent that philosophy was in a way enemy number one in the history of the West, right? It was a thing to be controlled, to be punished if it stepped out of line, right? In the Middle Ages, there was a famous saying that philosophy should be the handmaid of theology, that philosophers should really think that they were the ones who were in a position to figure out what's going on. It was really the theologian that would be allowed that, and the philosopher just had to kind of help out. And there are still lots of people who talk about philosophy as this thing that's there just to help out what serious and important people do, say in the sciences or something else. But so not only is philosophy in the Western tradition this kind of this thing that's been kind of historically punished and seen as a threat, right? You also have this long tradition of the idea of martyrdom in the Western tradition, where people are put to death for their ideas. And what they believe. And what started to really strike me when I became a student of South Asia was how different the history there was up until colonialism. And then after European colonialism, you see a lot of these same things in South Asia, especially increasingly now as there's an increasing move to a far-right politics. But historically, if you go back to the very start of the South Asian intellectual tradition, right, there was a widely appreciated distinction between Brahmanas. Brahmanas were intellectuals by hereditary intellectuals. Basically, it was their caste job to be intellectuals. And, if you were going to find philosophers, you could find Brahmanas or Brahmins doing that. But if you didn't like the conventional wisdom that was underwriting the social norms of the day, You could decide to leave conventional society and become a shramana. And the word shramana means striving. It's the idea that you strike out on your own. And you try and make a go of it as an intellectual. And so what Shramanas would do is they would leave kind of ordinary society. They would then undertake various practices of experimentation, body modification, right, lifestyle experimentation, and then they would either come up with some philosophy themselves, or they would join some group. And perhaps the most famous Shramana thinker was the Buddha, right? Incredibly famous because the Buddha ended up, inspiring people through South Asia, but then also through Asia and now all over the world, right? But Buddhism was a Shramana movement, and it was specifically a movement that took aim in many ways at the established norms of the day, and people were okay with that. And if you think about the charge of promoting false gods and corrupting the youth, it simply wouldn't have made sense in South Asia because everybody had their own gods and different gods, and everybody had their own idea of what it was to raise the youth. And there wasn't, the idea of martyrdom you don't find this in the South Asian tradition, right? It only shows up quite late in the game when we have early Sikh gurus being put to death by local Muslim rulers for not converting to Islam. That's kind of the first show of this kind of thing, right? But when you go back kind of far enough in the South Asian tradition and you're looking at ideas and philosophies that are indigenous, you don't find this type of worry about philosophy as something to be contained and punished. And if anything else, it's just the opposite. Everybody was kind of free to make a go of it themselves if they could, right? And then if you were someone like the Buddha who had managed to, be especially convincing, you would be highly regarded by the powers of the day, who would seek out, your audience and maybe even your approval, because, the thought was that, if you were to get one of these philosophers to maybe visit you, that somehow lends legitimacy to your government, right? So it was a completely different intellectual environment, and in a way it's a lot more like what we prize, especially in relatively free and open societies. I say relatively because there are all sorts of limits that are not necessarily good things in many parts of the world, but a lot of times places where you can learn philosophy, there's this kind of idealization of this open society where you can take up and argue different positions, and that's just fine, right? And in a way thought to be part of the health of an intellectual community or scholarly body. And you didn't have that in the Western tradition up until, oddly, after colonizing various parts of the world, including South Asia. In a separate video lecture, I'm going to talk about the rise of the philosophy of free speech and John Stuart Mill, and how this oddly has something to do with his experiences in South Asia as a colonial administrator. But anyways, let's not go there right now. But all I want to note for at the moment is that what we have come to be accustomed to in the Western tradition, this long tradition of oppressing and punishing philosophers and intellectuals, is like a cultural quirk, right? It's not the way humans have to be everywhere, and it hasn't been that way everywhere. It's been that way somewhere, right? And so when we're trying to understand what philosophy is, it's that challenge is made a bit difficult, especially in a westernized world where the intellectual history that we inherit has been so anti-philosophy, right, from the very start. And it still permeates public discourse where a lot of people think that, philosophy is a waste of time. What is it that you're going to be able to do with your life if you learn philosophy, right? So people are usually, terribly ignorant about how well philosophy students tend to do on things like standardized tests, right? They tend to come in, for things like the LSAT and other graduate record admissions scores. They tend to come in, second only to folks in physics and math, etc. Way ahead of folks in kind of non-science or non-math degrees. And there's a kind of a general lack of appreciation for how awesome philosophy is that permeates a westernized world, right? It's treated as this kind of impractical thing that gets in the way of real life, and what a waste of time, right? Nothing can be farther from the truth, but that's the myth. And we inherit that from a tradition that's disliked philosophy from the start. Okay, so in a way, if you're interested in philosophy, right, you are interested in something that is counterculture in the Western tradition. Okay, so so then, what is philosophy? How do we come to terms with what it is? Given that in a westernized world, the cultural tradition that we're inheriting and what we know about philosophy typically, right, is really filtered through a tradition that would have preferred that if philosophers just kind of were seen and not heard, right? Or maybe just not even seen at all. Okay, so for me, I found this kind of, vexing and confusing. And now I think, after a long time, and philosophy is like this, sometimes the simplest matters just take a long time to think about, because you have to clear out the clutter, and the clutter, it just builds up. So I think I have a pretty simple explanation of what it is. That's right. But first, to get there, let's first talk about what reason is. Okay, so people often have a very loose way of talking about reason that's incorrect. Okay, so often people talk about reason as though to be reasonable is to believe certain things thought to be reasonable. Okay, but when you actually take a course on, say, logic or critical thinking, and you're looking at the very basics of what logic consists in, both formal and informal, and across its various versions and manifestations, what you find is that reason doesn't have anything to do with what you believe, or even necessarily with what is true. Reason has to do with the support that reasoning, or the characteristic or the quality of something being reasonable, has to do with the support that thoughts, the fancy word is propositions, you could also call them premises, that premises provide for conclusions. So when you have a bunch of reasons, when you have a bunch of thoughts that together are reasonable, right, that they kind of exemplify the trait of being reasonable, what you have is one part of that collection functions as reasons or premises that support another part that functions as the conclusion, and together we call that an argument, right? Reasons for a conclusion or premises for a conclusion. Now, there are three basic forms of reason that you would learn about if you took an intro to critical thinking course. Okay, it's pretty standard stuff. There's deduction, induction, and inference to the best explanation. Okay, so a deductive argument, deduction is in a way provides us that a kind of very stringent standard of what this property of reasonableness consists in, right? All reason consists in the support that the evidence or the premises provide for the conclusion. Okay, but in a deductive argument, the conclusion is thought to reasonably follow from the premises only in one case, if the truth of the conclusion follows from the truth of the premises. So this is what we call a valid deductive argument. A valid deductive argument is an argument where the conclusion has to be true if the premises are true. Now, this is very different from the premises being true or the conclusion being true, right? It's an if, right? The conclusion has to be true if the premises are true. So you could have a valid deductive argument with false propositions, right? The propositions that are thoughts that comprise the premises and the conclusion are all false. Here's my standard example. The moon is made of green cheese. All items made of green cheese are yummy. The moon is yummy. Okay, so this argument is valid because if the premises are true, the conclusion that the moon is yummy must be true too. But that's very different from the argument being what's called sound. A sound argument has not only this property of validity, but also true premises and a true conclusion, right? So you can have, but in order to get a sound argument, right, it first has to be valid. And a valid argument, the validity of an argument, is independent of its truth, right? So one of the neat things about understanding the validity of an argument is that it doesn't depend upon what you think is true, right? Because it has nothing to do with your beliefs. Because the validity of an argument simply has to do with the support that premises provide for a conclusion. Okay. So, to really drive this home, you can think of an argument comprised entirely of true claims that fails to have any semblance of reason, right? So today is September 6th, 2019. It's true as I'm recording this. That's the date. Donald Trump is the president of the United States. Premise number 2 is also true at this moment. Justin Trudeau is prime minister of Canada at this moment. Also true. Therefore, my name is Sean Ranganathan. That last conclusion is also true. Okay, so I said a bunch of true things, but notice that what I said in the way of the reasons or the premises doesn't support the conclusion, right? The date and who's president of the US and who's prime minister of Canada has kind of nothing to do with what my name is, right? And so just because, Trump and Trudeau are in charge of the US and Canada respectively today on September 6th doesn't entail that my name is Sean Ranganathan. Okay, so, thinking about validity and about how truth really has nothing to do with it is very salutary, I find, because what it does is it blows the lid off of this very ordinary, mistaken way of thinking about reason as something that has to do with the kinds of things you're supposed to believe, right? The kinds of things that are true or plausible, right? Reason doesn't have anything to do with that. Okay, so the second very kind of standard version of reasoning that you will learn about in a critical thinking course is induction. So an inductive argument is an argument where the premises provide support for a conclusion, but that support it's a lower threshold than validity. Right? So an inductive argument is the kind where, if it's strong, you have good reason to take the conclusion seriously, right? So on the basis of the evidence, right, an induction would be strong if it supports the conclusion as the kind of thing that's probable or likely or plausible. Right? Now, a strong inductive argument is different from a cogent inductive argument. In a cogent inductive argument, not only do you have this strength where the evidence supports the conclusion, but the evidence is also credible and worth taking seriously. Right? And so you can have a strong inductive argument on the basis of bad information. Right? Bad information pooled together can be the basis for a prediction. And if the evidence supports the prediction, it's strong, even if the evidence is bad or wrong or not true, right? So one example that I like to think of to kind of bring all of these issues to fore is the prediction that Hillary Clinton was going to be the president elect in 2016 of the US, right? So if the data was good, if it wasn't really kind of messed around with, or if it was really a complete representative pool of the data, then it seems like it was not only a strong induction, but a cogent induction. And the fact that she didn't end up being president doesn't falsify the induction, because the induction isn't supposed to give you this kind of certainty. It's just supposed to provide good support for an educated guess, basically, right? So, right, there's plenty of good evidence to that effect, right? Now, so then you would have said, well, that was a cogent induction, right? The evidence was good and it seemed to support, Clinton being president. It turned out to be false, but, it's an induction, not a deduction. Where you expect a higher degree of connection between the evidence and the conclusion. Now, if it turned out that the evidence was bad, say the polling was incomplete, right, and it wasn't really at the end of the day credible, you could say, well, it certainly supported the conclusion that Clinton was going to be president, but it wasn't a cogent induction. It was simply a strong induction. Right. And how you fall on and it's a kind of an interesting question, which was the right story. Right. So the fact that, the election, her failure to win, hinged on the electoral college votes and not the popular votes, seems to be something that wasn't significantly appreciated ahead of time. And so, since that makes a difference, right, you might think that the evidence that people were basing their predictions on wasn't complete. It didn't really take into account everything that should have been reckoned with in the prediction, right? Okay, so, but, either way, it seems like a strong induction. Whether it was cogent or not, it's a different question. But you can also have a weak induction where the evidence doesn't support the conclusion. And notice that weakness comes apart from truth, right? So I could have a weak induction about the future, about, the weather next week based on an observation of the weather last month, right? So my observation about the weather last month could be completely accurate, but it doesn't, how things were last month seems to be quite disconnected from, how things are going to be next week. And even if it turned out to flukily be, that the prediction ends up being right, you could still say it's a weak argument because there wasn't this type of evidentiary support for the conclusion. Okay, then finally, the third kind of reasoning that we encounter when we study very basic critical thinking is inference to the best explanation. So inference to the best explanation is a kind of comparative effort where you compare competing theories of a certain phenomena, and then you choose, on the basis of the comparison, the best option. Now, once again, inference to the best explanation, like all the other forms of reasoning, comes apart from truth, because what makes a proposal the best explanation is at its best relative to the alternatives, right? So you could have a best explanation that in time turns out to be false, and people need to revise their account of what's going on. Scientists do this all the time, right? That's the way science works. They think about the possible explanations of a certain phenomena. They choose the best explanation that they have at the time, given the evidence. And then maybe at some further point, right, new evidence comes along, and then some new account seems more plausible, given the new evidence, right? And then all of a sudden, what counts as the best evidence, the best explanation changes, right? Uncritical people think that this is a problem, right? The fact that scientists change their mind seems like a reason not to an uncritical person to not take science seriously. But this is mistaken because they don't understand what it is that scientists are doing. What they're doing is they're trying to come up with the best explanation given the evidence available to them at the time. And, in the fullness of time, when they find new evidence, they might have to revise their explanation, and they will. You can be pretty much guaranteed that that's going to happen. That doesn't mean that it's unreasonable. Just the opposite. It's reasonable. Now, of course, the fallacy here is that if you thought that the explanation had to be true in order for it to be reasonable, right, you would be upset when scientists come to think that some theory they were sweet on turns out to be wrong. Right? And you might think, they didn't know what they were talking about. But that's the mistake, the criteria that was driving the process, right? The best explanation wasn't the best explanation because they knew it was true. It was the best explanation because it was better than the alternatives that they had going, right? So, this is part of understanding reason. Now, one of the things that's kind of really important, I think, to observe when you think about deduction, induction, and inference to the best explanation is that truth and reason are really two different things altogether. And so when you think about what reason is, reason has to do with the objectivity in thinking. So recall earlier I said that objectivity had to do with, it's the property of the data as something we can converge on while there's room for disagreement, right? And when you think about what makes an argument or proposal reasonable, right, that it provides the kind of support for a certain outcome or conclusion, right? That property of being reasonable is the kind of thing we can converge on as we disagree about things like the credibility of the evidence or the truth of the premises or the conclusion, right? So the evaluation of the truth of whether the reasons that we have is right or not is kind of an independent question of whether the reasons provide support for their respective conclusions, right? And so reasoning is this concern with the objectivity of thinking, exactly what we can converge on as there's room for disagreement. And reasonable people, right, what it is that makes a person reasonable is they're able to engage in this activity of thinking about how reasons support a conclusion independently of what they take to be true. Okay, that's a kind of very basic constraint on what it is to be a reasonable person. It's not impossible. It's the kind of thing that philosophers teach, right, in their various courses. It's the kind of thing that we try and perfect ourselves, right? And the reason why it's possible for us to work on this is that there are clear procedural criteria that allow us to track the reasonableness of arguments that are independent of our assessment of whether parts of the argument are true or not, right? So truth kind of goes this way and reason that way. And if something happens to be both reasonable and true, fantastic. Okay, the thing is, though, of course, that we don't often, when we're conducting research, we don't know what is true. So we settle for what's reasonable, right? And moreover, even if we know what's true, just because we have a pile of true claims or beliefs doesn't mean that we're being reasonable, right? And my Donald Trump, Justin Trudeau, therefore my name is Sean Ranganathan example is a case in point, right? We can know all sorts of true things. It doesn't mean that we're being reasonable when we put them together. So, reason helps us overcome our ignorance. It also provides a criterion to sort out our thinking, whether or not our thoughts are true or not. And in a way, it provides a very basic constraint on what it is to track what's objective in the world of thinking. So, the psychological benefit of being reasonable, right? It allows us to get over our own egocentrism and understand something we might not agree with. So, it shows that dissent is rational. From the epistemic benefits, the knowledge benefits, it allows us to learn something new, right? At the very least, we can learn what other people think in the way of arguments, right? Which we might disagree with, but we could understand that they have these reasons that support a certain conclusion that they are interested in, right? That's a kind of learning, and that's a kind of learning we do in philosophy. What's really important about all this is that the procedure of reasoning is content neutral. It doesn't have to do with anybody's perspective or cultural upbringing or beliefs or what they want out of life, right? So there are all sorts of very contingent things about us that tie us to traditions and to other people and to our own past. And then reason really, it's not that it doesn't stop us from having all of these preferences and beliefs and identities, but it's just something different. So it kind of leaves all of that intact and gets us to consider something apart from ourselves, right? So reason, it doesn't undermine our beliefs or it doesn't stop us from thinking that certain things are true. It's really just concerned with a very different kind of exercise. So when I know that Donald Trump is president of the United States and my name is Sean Ranganathan, right? Reason gets me to appreciate that these are really two separate matters that don't have anything to do with each other, right? It's not like reason undermines the reality of my name being Sean Ranganathan. That's true, right? Whether it's reasonable, completely different question, right? And you could say that about Trump. He's president of the United States. Whether that's reasonable, completely different question. All right. So what I think is also really important about reasoning is that it helps us render explicit what's often implicit, right? Because when we try to understand someone's reasons for their conclusions, and especially if we try to hold them to the deductive standard where we want the reasons to entail their conclusions, such that if the reasons are true, the conclusion has to be true, is that when we try to understand people this way, we have to tease out of them things that are either entailed by the things that they say, unspoken assumptions that if you supplied would explain why it is or how it is that they get to their conclusions, right? And so the entire process of reasoning helps us come to terms with what's implicit in what other people are concluding, okay? in a manner that's completely distinguished from what it is that we ourselves believe, right? Because if you engage in this process of reasoning where you're rendering explicit people's reasons, you can understand something that's quite different from what it is that you take to be true. So philosophical thinking, I would suggest, is basically the application in the first instance of deductive reasoning pressed in the service of understanding a diversity of perspectives and theories. Okay, and I call this process of applying deductive reasoning to render explicit the reasons that thinkers have for their conclusions, explication. So when we explicate, what we're trying to do is we're trying to render explicit the reasons people have for their conclusions, right? Such that if the reasons were true, the conclusions would be true. And further, to discover the topic of inquiry as what competing theories of have to say about a topic, right? So it's not simply, so philosophy isn't just about understanding someone's reasons for their conclusion. It also lets us appreciate that those conclusions are controversial. That if you perform this process of rendering explicit reasons for conclusions across the board, what you will find is there are lots of competing theories that entail contrary and contradictory conclusions. Okay, and then when you follow all of this to the root, which is what it is that people are disagreeing about, right? You understand the topic of contention objectively, right? What it is that people are converging on as they disagree, right? And so this entire process is a process of research, right? Which is why it's philosophy. So philosophia, love of wisdom. To love wisdom is not, that's, so the love of wisdom, that's what philosophy means. It's the Greek idea that distinguishes, that's supposed to be distinguished from simply being wise, right? So, there were some people who claimed to be wise. Those were sophists, right? And so a sophist thinks that they have the answer to questions. A philosopher is someone who isn't tied to them, isn't kind of committed to themselves knowing the answer to questions. Rather, they're interested in the process that could lead them to some type of answer to those questions, right? So philosophy is a project of research. It's very different from a project of pontificating or telling it how it is. What you're doing in philosophy is that because you're applying explication to render explicit people's reasons for their conclusions, and then you're doing this across the board to appreciate topics of contention, right? You are discovering something about which we can be wise. And one of the things I would suggest is that you could decide simply to take one position in a debate, or and in a way you're always doing just that in any disagreement. Some side of the disagreement is probably going to seem more appealing than another. But you might, one way to think about the right answer as being objective is that when you get to the right answer, you have an appreciation and it sheds light on what it is that we've been disagreeing about all this time. So in the case of philosophy, it elucidates points of contention. And that itself allows us a certain intellectual freedom. It allows us to get rid of our biases and prejudices that were, clouding our thinking. Okay. Now, you can apply philosophical thinking, explication, to thinking about really any problem where the problem has to do with what someone believes or says, right? You can use this process to extricate the reasons that they might have for a conclusion. But if you apply this across the board, and you take this far, okay, you don't just settle on one or two theories, right? You really kind of pursue this. I think what you start to see there are these very basic points of disagreement that anchor basic parts of philosophical research. Okay, so if you pursue the disagreements about reality, right, you find that what we call metaphysics, the philosophy of reality, is a disagreement about the necessary or the contingent, what has to be the case and what is but doesn't have to be. Right? And so metaphysical theories are going to take different positions on these topics. Epistemology is kind of this disagreement about knowledge. And if you really track disagreement across theories of knowledge, right, you're going to get a disagreement about justification and truth. One way that this disagreement plays out is in terms of what is more important in an account of knowledge. And in contemporary philosophy and epistemology, right, a lot of the theories that are popular, I noticed, really kind of fall within one side of the possible disagreement. And if you carry around this project out cross culturally, you'll find that there are all sorts of other theories that contribute to our disagreement about knowledge that take very different positions. Okay. Then there's logic. So logicians are interested in kind of this follows from property, the property of some thought or proposition or something following from something else. And logicians disagree about theories or systems of inference, where inference just is this follows from relationship. And then you get ethics, right? It's a disagreement about the right procedure or good outcome. So ethical theories are going to take very different positions on what is the right and what is the good. Now, you discover these as the basic topics of philosophical disagreement by pursuing the topic explicatively, by looking at the reasons that various thinkers have for their conclusions, formulating these reasons into a kind of a coherent theory that entails their conclusions, and then looking at the contradictory conclusions to figure out what is it that of such theories, what is it that thinkers are really, what is it that they're disagreeing about? And then you have an objective appreciation for the topics of philosophy. And you're doing all of this by employing a procedure, namely explication, that's objective, right? It doesn't depend upon how you see the world or what you think is true. It's about using deductive validity to tease out reasons that entail conclusions, and then you understand the conclusions as these controversial matters, and then you understand, and then you deduce from this the topic of a philosophical area of inquiry of, it's basically what it is that they're disagreeing about. You're basically using your logical skills the whole way, and never do you need to sub in what you think. And so you can be completely agnostic and engage in philosophical research. It doesn't depend or require that you take a side, right? And in fact, sometimes taking a side might make it a little difficult to really, psychologically, right? You might have a hard time, coming to terms with your own intuitions and prejudices. But that's part of being a philosopher, right? You're really working on intellectual personal boundaries. And understanding others as an exercise that doesn't require any type of basic common worldview. Okay, so philosophy then I think is anything that requires this kind of philosophical thinking. And so here's my counterexample. So one of the things that philosophers love doing is they love coming up with counterexamples. So if you have any proposal, they're going to say, what about this? Right? And the idea is that if they can show that there's some counterexample that's not covered by your proposal can't really be universally true, right? But yet that's a kind of ideal we're going for, right? Especially when you think about philosophy as this explicative endeavor where what you're thinking about is abstract. It's not about kind of particular events and particular perspectives, and you're looking at the issue rather synoptically as what we can disagree about from varying standpoints. That the possibility of a counterexample to a proposal that generalizes about all of that seems like a good way to knock down, what someone's saying. So consider any counterexample. I'm asking you, I'm inviting you, right? Imagine that, that there are a host of other accounts of what philosophy is. And you could say, look, some people think that philosophy is X, and that's different from what you are saying, right? So, but yet, it seems like they're doing philosophy. So you're, insofar as they're not doing what you're doing or saying that they're doing what you're doing, it seems like you don't have an accurate account of what philosophy is. Okay, so here's my response to that. The only way we're going to understand any counterexample to this is by understanding it as a contribution to the disagreement about what philosophy is. But If that's the case, then we have to understand people's reasons for their conclusion about what philosophy is, and then we have to understand philosophy as this controversial thing that differing theories of philosophy have something contrary to say about, and the topic is what we objectively converge on as we disagree. And then notice we're doing philosophy as I said philosophy is. We're explicating, right? So it doesn't really matter what your account of philosophy is. The moment you bring it to the table and you say, look, I have another proposal, right? We're going to have to understand it as contributing to the possibilities of the disagreement by way of this explicatory process. And then all of a sudden, I think we just have to accept that when we're doing philosophy, we're doing this explication thing. And we accept that, or we have to accept that, because it's what we can converge on as we're disagreeing about what philosophy is, right? So one of the interesting things about disciplines is that they allow us, they're the kinds of things we don't have to believe. They're just the kind of thing that we converge on as we find ourselves engaging in a disagreement in an area. And so philosophy is objective as a discipline because it's what we converge on when we're disagreeing about philosophy. And what we're converging on is explication, right? That's the procedure that's allowing us to understand various proposals as contributing to a disagreement. So one of the outcomes then of this line of thinking about philosophy is that philosophy is really best understood as a method of thinking, right? It's a method of thinking that you can then apply to all sorts of different challenges, right? And it's why philosophy, learning philosophy, taking time to study philosophy can really help you in all areas of life because it forces you to come to terms with the reasons and the assumptions that you're relying on for certain conclusions that you are attached to or interested in, right? And sometimes if we're not really transparent about these reasons, we're not going to be able to necessarily even make good on the things that we're expecting to be the case, or what we want to aim for, because we haven't really thought things through as far as we should or could. Also worth noting is that the main reason I think that people often don't see or find philosophy in alien cultures and in ancient traditions is that how philosophy is preserved and written down, right, doesn't determine whether it's philosophy. Really, it's only what makes something philosophy is that you need philosophical thinking to understand it, right? But if you don't appreciate that, then you don't really think that in order to understand philosophy, it's your responsibility to think philosophically, right? You don't see that as your responsibility. So what ends up happening is that people don't find philosophy when they don't take on the responsibility to think philosophically, because what they want is they want to be spoon-fed, basically, whatever it is that they're expecting philosophy to look like. And, if the philosophical texts or what we have left over from centuries of, hand-me-downs doesn't meet expectations, then people conclude that there's no philosophy here, which is a kind of deep mistake. The corollary of this is that people often assume that you don't actually have to be a philosopher to study philosophy. But if to be a philosopher is to think philosophically, and if you need to think philosophically to understand philosophy, you have to be a philosopher to study philosophy. And what we often find, especially in the study of non-Western philosophy, is people who are not philosophers trying to study and talk about philosophy, usually historians and philologists and linguists and historians of religion, and there are countless various scholarly approaches to social scientific and historical data that end up being misapplied to the study of philosophy. And of course, you're not going to find philosophy via those means, because philosophy, in order to find philosophy, you have to think philosophically. And thinking philosophically is about rendering explicit the reasons that people have for the conclusions that they hold. Okay, so just a couple of quick counter arguments to or objections rather, or rather just one counter argument objection is I've sometimes heard it from colleagues even that, well, the thing is that in philosophy it's not the case that most arguments from philosophers are deductive arguments. Sometimes they're inductive arguments, or they could even be inference to the best explanation, right? And in a way, my argument is a kind of inference to the best explanation, and it does have inductive elements in it, right? So you might say, but so then it's inappropriate to try to use deduction to try to understand philosophy. And my response is that when you explicate, when you're thinking philosophically in this way, you're not assuming that that's the way the person you're trying to understand was even trying very hard to meet up to, right? What you're trying to do is you're trying to render explicit all the assumptions and reasons that they would need in order to get their conclusion. So, for instance, if the assumption that a philosopher has is that the right approach to a certain argument is inductive, right, you would have to render that explicit by the application of deductive reasoning, right? But then once you've rendered all of these assumptions explicit, you have an explicated argument where if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. So it's really such a very basic part of philosophy to think in this way, because what it does is that it brings to the surface all the assumptions and reasons that thinkers are operating with, that they either say explicitly or is logically entailed by other things that they are saying, right? That you need, and sometimes maybe even that isn't logically entailed, that has to be assumed, and say they don't necessarily make that explicit or defend, right? In thinking philosophically, you unearth all of this, and then you're also able to engage in a kind of critical examination, right? Because if you find out that a certain thinker or perspective requires certain unargued for premises in order to get their argument off the ground deductively, then you've got a criticism that you can present about the argument. Okay, so I'm going to leave aside explication now. I'm just, I think I've said enough to show that you really need this method of thinking in order to do philosophy and to really understand what philosophy is, and that at the end of the day, it's what we are converging on when we're disagreeing about various topics in philosophy. So now I want to talk about the opposite of being reasonable. Okay, and so, if you simply wanted to know what philosophy is, I guess I've told you that. If you're interested at all as to why philosophy has been persecuted in the Western tradition, right, you need to understand a little bit about anti-philosophy. If you're a student of mine watching this is what I'm going to talk about in this next section is important. So, please don't tune out. I guess if you only tuned in because you wanted, some kind of positive account of philosophy, you've got that. Okay, so the opposite of philosophical thinking, right? Philosophical thinking is just kind of one specific version of reasonable thinking, where you're employing deduction as a mean to unearth all the reasons that some perspective requires in order to secure their controversial conclusion, right? The opposite of this kind of thinking, of reasonable thinking, is thinking that prioritizes truth in explanation. So you could call this interpretation. I didn't make up this label. If you look at the famous philosophers of the 20th century, very many of them defended interpretation or talked about interpretation. They either flirted with this idea or explicitly endorsed it. And I'm thinking about philosophers in the analytic tradition like Quine, Davidson, and Wittgenstein, and in the continental tradition, Heidegger, Gadamer, even Derrida. It's explicitly something that's been either flirted with or affirmed by many of the leading thinkers in the 20th century. in Western philosophy, and there's a historical reason for why interpretation was often defended. But first, it's important to really understand what interpretation is. Interpretation is the effort to explain anything and everything, including other people's perspectives, arguments, and ideas, in terms of what you, the interpreter, believes is true. So it doesn't matter for the purpose of interpretation whether what you believe is true or not. Okay, it could be true, it could be false, but what's important for interpretation is that the explanation depends on what you take to be true. Okay, and as I've already noted, that this is very different from reason, because when you're concerned about reason, you're interested in the support that reasons have provide for a conclusion, independently of whether they are true or not. Okay, so interpretation kind of abandons reason as a project, and it recommends that we have to take a kind of egocentric perspective as the starting point of understanding others and ourselves. I guess yourself. You might think, how else are you going to understand yourself? But the interpreter thinks that it's an inescapable feature of understanding that you are always deferring to something that you take to be true in your judgment or assessment of things. Okay, so it's a very different model of understanding from explication. So, all right. So the first problem is just that it violates reason. Okay, so people who adopt interpretation are, thereby unreasonable, right? They abandon the basic requirements of reasons. The second problem with interpretation, people who interpret can only ever understand what they agree with, and they cannot learn anything new, right? That's a big problem because, by definition, if you can only ever understand something in terms of what you take to be true, you can never understand it in terms of what you thought was false, right? Or what doesn't accord with your worldview. But that's what learning is. Learning is about acquiring kind of knowledge about things that you hadn't thought about or you didn't necessarily, wasn't part of your worldview. Okay, the third problem with interpretation, interpreters confuse learning with being told what is true, right? So, when I see a student of mine who's an interpreter, they think that my job as a teacher is to simply unload truths. But that's mistaken, because often in education, higher education, right, the job is to teach you what's reasonable, which may not be true, but also to explore things that are mistaken and also to investigate topics that we're not sure about, right? But interpretation confuses all of research and learning with, simply knowing the truth. The fourth problem with interpretation, interpreters cannot tolerate disagreement or reason, right, in identifying with thoughts that constitute their outlook. When others deny the thoughts they identify with, they feel personally denied, right? Because they define themselves in terms of certain thoughts that constitute their beliefs, right? And they think that they require these thoughts in order to understand. And so if someone doesn't agree with it and rejects these thoughts, because the interpreters basically attach themselves to these thoughts, they feel personally rejected. They are hence not capable of being critical, right? They can't actually be critical of the thoughts that they think is true. For not only does criticism consist of some contrary position, right, something beyond what they take to be true, but it's also experienced as a personal slight. And I think this creates a sense of paranoia among interpreters, right? Because they experience dissent as a personal slight, right? Everybody who doesn't see things the way they do seems like a threat, right? And they feel like others are out to get them, basically. Okay? All right. The fifth problem with interpretation, interpreters will replace what others say when they disagree with that with what they take to be true, right? Because the only way they can understand what someone else is saying is in terms of what they take to be true. So it's a kind of colonial process of erasing dissent and alternative perspectives. The interpreter has to kind of constantly assert their perspective on the things that they're studying. The sixth problem with interpretation, because interpreters treat their thoughts and beliefs as the contents of reason, really what you need to understand, they accuse anyone who does not agree with them of being biased. Okay, now this is ironic, right? But I've seen it time and time again. Now, when I run into someone who's attached to interpretation, not only do they show all the other problems that I listed before, and for every 100 students I run into, maybe one person is an interpreter. Though I suspect there are more, but they often try and they might have coping mechanisms, but at least 1%, from what I can tell, does this. They are quick to accuse others of bias because others are making a case for something that they disagree with, right? And they don't seem to appreciate that criticism of others as biased is predicated on their own bias, right? Their own attachment to a certain perspective that they conflate with the possibilities of what's reasonable. The seventh problem with interpretation, because interpreters think that thinking is believing, right? The same as whatever it is that they take to be true, they feel menaced and bullied when they are taught something they do not agree with. It seems to them as though they are being forced or required to believe something that their conscience will not allow, right? I've seen this too. It's kind of this remarkable reaction. People who attach themselves to interpretation feel really put out by the requirement to come to some terms with things that they don't already believe, right? You'll often hear charges of that there's a kind of freedom of belief as speech is being suppressed and only one line or perspective is being heard, right? And they're saying this because their view that they think should be the master view is not being treated that way. Okay, the eighth problem with interpretation, and this is a very significant problem with interpretation. Interpreters confuse a thought about something, right? So consider the thought, this argument is valid, with a belief B about such a thought, such as I believe this argument is valid. So the thought, it's raining outside, is different from the thought, I believe that it's raining outside, because the thought, I believe that it's raining outside, is true if I believe it. But the thought, it's raining outside, is true only if it's raining outside, right? So these are two very different thoughts with differing logical properties. And the I believe it's raining outside, or I believe this is a valid argument, is called an intentional context. It's famously studied by logicians and philosophers of language. Intentional contexts have differing logical properties from the thoughts that they're about. So, if I am worried that I'm going to fail a test, it's true that I'm worried that I'm going to fail a test by virtue of my worrying about it, right? That's what makes me worried about it. Because I'm worrying about it, it's true that I'm worrying about a test, right? But, the question of whether I'm going to fail the test doesn't depend upon whether I'm worrying about it, right? So they're really two different questions. And so the funny thing about an intentional context is that the truth of the claim is mediated through the psychology of the believer or anybody, the person with the propositional attitude, the attitude towards thoughts. So, but this is pretty much the basic mistake that interpreters tend to make. I've thought about this. I wondered if interpreters don't have to make this mistake, but I think that they often do, because what happens is if you challenge an interpreter and say, listen, it's not just about what you believe. There are these kind of thoughts, and we can consider them independently of whether we think they're true or not. They'll often engage in some type of reflection and then come to the conclusion that any thought that they think about is something that they have some type of belief about, right? And so, but then they think that we're always explaining everything in terms of what we believe. But what they've done is they've kind of confused these two kinds of mental activities, right? Like the thinking and then having an attitude about the thinking. All right. The ninth problem with interpretation. But by the way, sorry. Just to finish that criticism. But once you make that mistake, once you confuse the thought with the belief about the thought, then it will seem like any explanation by way of a thought is an interpretation, because you would have conflated thinking with believing. Okay. All right. The ninth problem with interpretation. History as an unfolding of competing narratives and perspectives is cut off. You simply can't understand history if you think that it's all about your perspective, because there's something that comes before your perspective, other perspectives, right? And if you have to understand everything in terms of your perspective, you're not going to be able to understand those other perspectives, right? So, ironically, and I say this ironically because often people who are interpreters will seem to be very interested in history. They'll want to give you a story about how everything has unfolded since the beginning of time, and they'll have a view about these things because they think that, you know, having such beliefs is part of what it is to be a reasonable person to think, right? But they're not really going to be able to understand anything but their own perspective. So history as this kind of real thing that happened is going to be something inaccessible to them. The 10th problem with interpretation: interpreters lack insight into their own philosophical choices as they confuse what they believe with the reasons that entail their choices, right? So so given that real arguments don't depend on beliefs but thoughts, then an interpreter will never really understand the reasons they have for their choices. And there's a reason why a belief can never really be a reason. Is because, let's consider the claim, I believe that it's raining outside, right? I believe that it's raining outside is true if I believe that, you know, because I'm believing it. So let's say I believe that it's raining outside. Does that give me a reason to take my umbrella out with me when I go for a walk? So it doesn't. And it doesn't give me a reason to take my umbrella out when I go for a walk for the following reason. Because the only reason that I believe that it's raining outside is true is because I believe it. It has nothing to do with it actually raining outside, right? So the thought it is raining outside gives me a reason to take my umbrella out. But the thought that it's raining outside is different from the belief. I believe that it's raining outside, right? And interpreters confuse these two kinds of claims. They confuse thinking and believing. But when you're clear about the distinction, it becomes pretty clear that beliefs can't really play much of a role in providing you reasons, right? Because, they're true for a very funny reason. They're true simply because of your attitude, right? So if it's true that it's raining outside, then I should take an umbrella. If it's true that I believe that it's raining outside, I don't have any reason to take an umbrella. I should rather find out if it's raining outside, right? And then the thought it's raining outside would provide me a reason to take an umbrella. Okay. So interpretation, but we're kind of back to the beginning, right? Interpretation is irrational. It abandons the very basic requirements of reason. And so interpreters live this kind of parallel life, right? There's reasonable people on one side, and then there are interpreters who are kind of very touchy and emotionally unstable. I kind of think of them as thin-skinned dictators, right? They want the rest of the world to behave as though it completely agrees with whatever it is they believe, because they are of the mistaken view that in order for them to understand the external world, they have to rely upon what they believe, right? And so instead of seeing the task of living as this challenge of trying to understand things that you might not agree with, right? They flip this, and they think that the challenge of living is about getting everybody to behave as though they agree with them, right? And if this doesn't happen, they usually have meltdowns. And they have meltdowns because of all the psychological stress that comes along with constantly having one's own expectations about the external world, right, refuted and denied by everything else, right, which doesn't operate according to the beliefs of the interpreter. Okay, I used to think that interpretation has a little bit of plausibility because, when you're a kid, it seems like learning is about learning what's true, right? And so as you get older, maybe in higher education, you see that learning might be about learning about controversies that we don't know what's true. But when you're really small, it seems like that's what you're supposed to be doing. And so you might think that, well, it's on the basis of that people generate this inclination to interpret. But the funny thing is that when kids are learning what's true, they're not explaining things in terms of what they take to be true. They're rather acquiring beliefs they didn't have before, right? Interpreters decide at some point they've learned everything there is to learn, and then from that moment on, it's all explanation in terms of what they believe, right? So they can't even rely upon their formative years as a child when they were, trying to acquire true beliefs about the world as an explanation for why it is that they behave the way they do. It's a choice. It's a philosophical choice to to adopt an irrational approach to life. But sadly, it's one that the rest of us have to put up with. Okay, so and for the following reason, that what interpreters do is they treat their own politics, right, as a foundation of understanding. They treat what they're willing to endorse and their own perspective as the foundation of understanding, right? And so they expect everybody else to conform. So this causes no problems when interpreters are of the same mind and they're living together. Okay, because then they're all kind of reinforcing each other's beliefs, and nobody seems to be doing anything that anybody finds unnerving, right? But you start to see signs of mental illness, right? Difficulty in reasoning, in interacting with others, experiences of persecution, paranoia, right? And this kind of effort to impose one's own worldview on others. Right? All of these sound pretty deleterious. You start to see these symptoms in interpreters when they are exposed to people who don't agree with them. Okay? And I think the most remarkable thing about an interpreter is they affect this remarkable flip in narrative. Right? So what they do is that they end up telling a story where it's the philosopher, right, conducting research and not trying to understand things in terms of what they take to be true. That it's the philosopher who's kind of biased and has the wrong political agenda. And they are the victims of the philosopher's heavy-handed dismissal of their perspective. This is, of course, unreasonable, right? But that's exactly what happens when you adopt this unreasonable method of understanding, right? It ends up basically projecting its problems onto everybody else. So I think what's interesting about interpretation, aside from the fact that it's totally bat crazy, right, is that it gives you an explanation for the West's historical trend and intolerance for philosophy and intellectual diversity, right? This kind of thin-skinned, dictatorial inclination that seeks to stamp out diversity, colonize, standardize, but also persecute intellectuals who don't agree with whatever it is you're supposed to be agreeing with, right? While that was a kind of dominant theme of the Western tradition, that's really an outcome of interpretation. Okay, and so if a tradition culturally has interpretation at its somehow at its kind of its kernel, as its basic model of understanding, then what it's going to do is going to reproduce this in a tradition as it goes along. And it will also enforce this type of ideological conformity violently, okay? By executing people who don't agree. Okay, so, I, for one, when I was doing my research and work, I tried to ignore this for a long time. But I started to realize that this freedom to ignore interpretation and interpreters is really a kind of privilege that you would have if you were only teaching kind of Eurocentric philosophy. Because then interpreters who come by their interpretive tendencies from the European intellectual tradition, when they take courses like this, there'd be nothing there that would trigger their irrational, their kind of maladaptive responses, because the beliefs that they have are going to be largely on show in the material that's being taught, right? So I think there's a lot of philosophy you can teach from the Western tradition where you can pretend like this isn't a problem, because it won't really be a problem in your class, right? Because everybody there, the people who come to interpret on the basis of their kind of Eurocentric intellectual heritage, will simply hear exactly what they came to hear. Okay, but I teach a lot of, so my research has been about neglected traditions of philosophy, and I teach a lot of non-Western philosophy philosophically. And so, for a long time, I've been noticing that this is a problem. And it's not just me, of course, as I talk to my colleagues, any colleague who teaches anything kind of non-standard, right? Say philosophy of feminism, or, I suspect if you did critical race theory, or if you did, gender and sexuality, or if you did anything that kind of ruffles the feather of what was thought to be kind of normal and normative in the Western tradition, you're going to get interpreters upset, right? And so I think really the only way to deal with this is to call it out and say we shouldn't tolerate it because it's irrational. So in my classes, I don't. I have like zero tolerance for it, because not only is it disruptive, but it's just so basically unreasonable, right? Because it has nothing to do with reason. It has to do with adopting a model of explanation that is by definition, is constitutionally unreasonable, right? Because reason, it has nothing to do with what you take to be true, and yet the interpreter thinks that that's the foundation of all explanation. Okay, this is a big topic. There's a lot to talk about. I just quickly want to answer the question as to why, and I will talk more about this in subsequent video lectures, but why is it that there is this historical association between interpretation and the Western tradition? So this is something that it took me a while to figure out, but I first went and studied the mismanaged study of South Asian philosophy, and then I noticed that everybody was basically what scholars were doing is, well, they were interpreting South Asian philosophy, and so they couldn't ever understand the moral philosophy from South Asia that didn't agree with their perspective. And then when I did my PhD on translating philosophy, and I started looking at the kind of the leading figures in 20th century continental analytic philosophy, as well as kind of the translation studies literature, I found this remarkable consensus that everybody assumed that when you're talking about thought, you're talking about linguistic meaning. So what's interesting about this assumption, and by the way, this idea that thought is the same as kind of language goes back to the Greeks, who had one word for speech and reason, logos. Okay. So what's interesting about this model of thought, that thought is linguistic meaning, is that if thought is linguistic meaning, then whenever you're trying to understand a thought, you're trying to understand the perspective that's encoded in your language. Okay, the culturally contingent perspective encoded in your language. But then the line between what's thinkable and what you believe by way of your cultural participation in your linguistic culture disappears. And then the line between thinking and believing disappears. And then it seems like anytime you're thinking, you're believing. But then if that's the case, any explanation is going to be an explanation in terms of what you believe, which is interpretation. So one of the things that I've discovered through my research is that this historical tendency in the Western tradition to resort to interpretation as a method of explanation is really a function of a deeper model of thought, which is culturally contingent. You don't find this in the South Asian tradition. It's affirmed by Confucius in China and denied by Lao Tzu and the Taoists, but it's the basic model in the Western tradition. And one reason I came to conclude that it is basic is that not only is there no real contrary model in this tradition, but in order to figure it out, in order to understand that that's really what's going on, you have to explicate a whole lot of contemporary Western theorizing and philosophy. And what you start to see is that in order to get the arguments off the ground, you need this one assumption, right? You need this assumption that when we're talking about thought, we're talking about linguistic meaning and the beliefs that are encoded in language. Okay, and once you have this kind of view, then translation becomes completely mysterious because it becomes inexplicable how we can make sense of and translate what people say in another language when their worldview doesn't accord with ours, right? And then it seems like we're trying to make sense of their beliefs in terms of our beliefs, and then there's just so much kind of ink spilled on this topic in 20th century philosophy. But anyways, I want to leave this there. I want to close this lecture with this. And I also want to emphasize that I think one of the outcomes of explicating, of thinking about unearthing and kind of revealing and rendering explicit reasons and assumptions that people need in order to get their conclusions off the ground, is that it also helps us to understand that sometimes the sources of really bad mistakes are things that seem kind of innocent, right? So I don't think that, people who interpret or interpreted historically kind of woke up and decided to purposely adopt a wacky theory of understanding, right? But they probably naively fell into it because at some point they started adopting a model of thought that said to the effect that, well, when you're thinking, right, you are engaging with how things seem to you from where you are.